Life Stories.
The Honest Woodcutter and the Village of Easy Words. The Price of Telling the Truth. In the Kingdom of England, in the late 14th century, there was a small village that sat on the edge of Northumberland's woods, not far from the market town of Rothbury and the river Coquet that ran cold and clear when the world was kind. The village was not famous. It had no stone walls like the great castles, and no grand church that drew pilgrims from far away. It had a handful of thatched roofs, a muddy lane that became a river when it rained, a bakehouse that smelled of rye, and a tavern that served thin ale and thick gossip. It had sheep on the hills, barley in the low fields, and a forest that began where the last fence ended. The forest was what kept the village alive. When winter bit hard, the forest gave fallen branches for fire. When a roof needed fixing, the forest gave beams that could hold a thatch against the wind. When a child coughed through the night, the forest gave herbs that soothed the throat if someone knew where to look. The village took from the forest the way a thirsty man takes from a cup, not thinking much about the hand that filled it. Most of the villagers spoke of the forest as if it were only timber and shadow. Edric did not. Edric was a woodcutter, 34 years of age, broad in the shoulders and plain in the face, with hair the color of wet bark and eyes that watched quietly. He lived in a small cottage at the edge of the village where the lane began to narrow and the trees began to thicken. He had no wife, no children, and no loud friends who pounded his back in the tavern. He worked, he paid what he owed, and he spoke only when there was something worth saying. If you asked the villagers what Edric was like, they would say the same thing with different words. He is honest, the baker would say, as if that were a flaw in the flour. He is too honest, the tavern keeper would add, as if honesty were a coat worn in summer heat. He is the sort of man who will tell you the truth even when it costs him, the shepherd would say, shaking his head as if such a man was bound to starve. And the village would laugh, because in that village, honesty was treated like a small stone in a shoe. It was not wicked, but it made walking harder, and most people preferred to kick it out. Edric's trouble was not that he preached. He did not stand in the lane and scold anyone for a crooked bargain. He did not thunder about sin and virtue like a traveling friar. He simply did not lie. That was enough to make him strange. It began, as many troubles do, with something small. One autumn morning, Edric was stacking cut logs beside the communal storehouse, where villagers kept wood for the poorest households and for the hearth that warmed the sick when illness spread. The storehouse was managed by Bronin, the village reeve, who acted as the village's voice when the Lord Steward came to collect dues. Bronin was 52, lean and sharp, with a trimmed beard and a smile that could make a man feel welcomed and watched at the same time. He wore a better belt than most men in the village, and his boots were always less muddy than they ought to have been. Bronin counted the logs, tapping them with the end of a short stick. "These are fine," he said. "Good oak, strong, dry enough." "They will burn well," Edric replied. Bronin's eyes slid to the rest of the woodpile, to the smaller pieces that Edric had set aside. "And those? The scraps?" "Those are ash and birch," Edric said. "They are for kindling. They are lighter." Bronin nodded as if he agreed, then turned and called to a boy who carried a slate and chalk. "Write down that Edric delivered 20 oak logs," he said. Edric looked at the pile. "It is 18. Bronin's smile stayed on his face, but it tightened like a rope pulled too hard. "Is it?" Edric pointed. "Count them again." Bronin's eyes flicked toward the lane where 2 villagers had paused to watch, then back to Edric. 18, 20, he said softly. "What does it matter? The poor will still be warm." "It matters because it is not true," Edric said. Bronin's smile did not fall, but something colder moved behind it. He leaned closer and lowered his voice. "If we say 20, it shows the steward that our village is doing well, which makes him less curious. Less curious is safer." Edric did not raise his voice. He did not clench his fists. He said only, "It is 18. The boy with the chalk hesitated, looking from one man to the other. Bronin gave a small laugh that sounded friendly if you did not listen carefully. "Very well," he said. "Write 18. The 2 villagers in the lane muttered. One of them, a farmer named Cuthred, spat into the mud. "Always making a fuss," he said. Edric heard him. He kept stacking wood. That day, word went through the village like a mouse through straw. Edric had embarrassed Bronin. Edric had slowed the work. Edric had risked the steward's attention. To Edric, it had been only the truth. By evening, the story had already grown, as stories do in the telling. In the tavern, men said Edric had called Bronin a thief. Women at the well said Edric wanted the poor to freeze just to prove a point. A boy swore Edric had threatened to report the reeve to the Lord's men, though the boy could not have repeated the words Edric actually used. Edric did not go to the tavern to defend himself. He ate his porridge, mended a strap on his axe, and went to sleep early because the next day would be another day of work. But the village did not let the matter rest. A week later, the steward arrived, riding with 2 guards and a clerk. The village gathered, as it always did, with hats in hands and careful faces. Bronin stepped forward, bowed, and spoke smooth words about harvests and duties. The clerk wrote. The steward listened with the bored patience of a man who believed he had heard every peasant lie in England. When the steward asked about the village's store of wood for the coming winter, Bronin spread his hands. "We are well supplied," he said. "Our woodcutters have been diligent." The steward nodded, and his gaze slid across the crowd, stopping briefly on Edric. Edric felt that gaze like a fingertip pressed to a bruise. The steward asked, "How many loads have been stored since Michaelmas?" Bronin answered quickly, 10 loads, my lord." Edric knew it was 8. The steward's clerk dipped his quill. Bronin's eyes did not turn toward Edric, but Edric could feel the village holding its breath, as if the whole crowd had become a single creature waiting to see whether the honest man would bare his teeth. Edric could have stayed silent. He could have let the number pass like wind through reeds. No one would have thanked him for speaking, and many would curse him for it. But a lie told to a powerful man did not become harmless just because it was spoken politely. Edric stepped forward 1 pace. "It is 8 loads," he said. There was a sound in the crowd, a soft gasp that turned into a hiss. Bronin's smile froze. The steward's eyes narrowed. He stared at Edric as if Edric were a curious insect. "And you are?" the steward asked. "Edric," Edric said. "I cut wood for the village and I deliver what I cut." Bronin laughed too loudly. "Forgive him, my lord," he said. "He is strict with numbers." The steward did not laugh. "Are you calling your reeve a liar, Woodcutter?" Edric held his hands open at his sides to show he carried no weapon. "I am saying the truth," he replied. "We have stored 8 loads since Michaelmas." The clerk paused, quill hovering. Bronin's voice became honey thick. "Edric measures only what he himself has carried. He forgets what others have brought." Edric looked around the crowd. Men shifted their weight. Eyes darted away. No one spoke. Edric understood then. No one would stand beside him, not because the truth was unknown, but because the truth was inconvenient. He could have argued. He could have named each man who had delivered wood and each day it had been delivered. He could have proven his point. Instead, he said, "If there are 10, they can be counted." The steward's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Count them," he said to the clerk, and then to Bronin. "If your woodcutter is wrong, he will pay for wasting my time. If he is right, you will pay for wasting it." Bronin bowed, still smiling. "Of course, my lord. We will count." By midday, the loads were counted. There were 8. The steward's mood did not brighten. A powerful man was never pleased to be reminded that peasants could mislead him, even if he caught the lie. He took his due, gave a warning about proper records, and rode away without another glance at Edric. When the hooves faded, the village turned on Edric the way dogs turn on the one who yelps. Cuthred shoved Edric's shoulder. "Do you think the steward will give us a reward for your truth?" he snapped. A woman named Merwin clutched her shawl tighter. "He will watch us now," she said. "He will come again sooner." The tavern keeper, old Halric, scowled as if Edric had spilled ale on his floor. "You have made Bronin look foolish," he said. Edric rubbed his jaw where a man's elbow had bumped him. "He made himself foolish," Edric replied, and that was the sharpest thing he said all day. Bronin stepped into the circle. His smile was back, but it had no warmth. "You are a good worker," Bronin said. "Loud enough for everyone to hear. No one doubts that. But a village is not only wood and number. A village is keeping peace. It is keeping the steward calm. It is making sure trouble passes us by." Edric met Bronin's eyes. "Peace built on lies is thin," he said. The crowd muttered again, unhappy, because Edric had put words to something they did not want to admit. Bronin's smile tightened. "Then perhaps you should cut wood for yourself this winter," he said, "and let the village rely on those who know how to speak properly." It was not a shout. It was not an accusation. It was a careful sentence spoken like a knife slipped between ribs. Edric understood what it meant. Work could be taken away. Wood could be withheld. Neighbors could turn their faces away when his roof leaked, or when sickness came. Truth had a price. That evening, as the sun sank and the forest line turned black against the sky, Edric walked the boundary path where the last fields met the first trees. The air smelled of damp leaves and distant smoke. A crow called once, then went silent. Edric rested a hand on the rough bark of an oak that had stood longer than any villager could remember. "I did not speak to cause trouble," he said quietly, though no one stood beside him. I spoke because it was true. The wind moved through the branches. It did not sound like words, but it did sound like something listening. Edric looked deeper into the trees. For a moment, he thought he saw a shape between two trunks. Not a man, not a beast, but a darker patch of darkness that seemed to watch him. When he blinked, it was gone, and the forest looked like only a forest again. He let out a slow breath and turned back toward his cottage. Behind him, somewhere far inside the woods, a branch cracked, not like the step of a deer, and not like the fall of dead wood. It sounded like a warning made by something that wanted to be heard. Edric did not run. He went home, sharpened his axe, and laid out his tools for the morning. Because if the village would not speak the truth, he would keep doing it for as long as he had breath. And in the village, in the warm light of the tavern, Bronin spoke with men who nodded and smiled, and the plans they made were not about wood. They were about Edric. When small lies begin to feel safe. As autumn deepened, the village settled into a pattern that looked like prosperity from a distance and felt like unease up close. Bronin did not announce that Edric would no longer be cutting wood for the communal storehouse. He did not need to. He simply stopped calling Edric's name when lists were read, and he gave the better work to men who smiled easily and asked no questions. Edric noticed first when a cart passed his cottage at dawn, creaking under fresh-cut logs that were bound for the storehouse. He recognized the cut by sight. The trees had been taken from the eastern edge of the forest, where the ground stayed dry and the wood seasoned well. Those trees had been marked by Edric weeks earlier. He watched the cart roll by without a word. When the driver glanced at him, Edric nodded once and returned to sharpening his axe. By midday, the truth had made its way to him, as it always did, carried by small kindnesses and careless mouths. Elspeth came by with a bundle of herbs tied in twine. She was known in the village for knowing which leaves eased fever and which roots settled a stomach. She stopped near Edric's fence, hesitated, then stepped closer. "You are not on the list," she said quietly. "I know," Edric replied. "They say Bronin wants fewer problems this winter." Edric smiled, thin and brief. "Then he has chosen poorly." Elspeth frowned. "You could have chosen silence." "So could he," Edric said. She sighed and held out the herbs. "For your cough. The nights are colder." Edric accepted them with a nod. "Thank you." When she turned to go, she paused. "Be careful," she said. "People forgive hunger more easily than embarrassment." That afternoon, Edric cut wood for himself. He chose fallen branches and older trees that leaned too far and threatened to come down in storms. He worked carefully, as he always had, leaving young growth untouched and cutting cleanly so the forest could heal. Other men did not. From the ridge, Edric could hear axes biting too deep, too fast. Trees that should have been left for another decade were coming down. Branches were hacked and abandoned where they fell. The forest began to look wounded. In the village, however, spirits were high. Bronin spoke often of abundance. At the tavern, he told men that the storehouse was fuller than it had been in years. He told them that the steward had been satisfied, which was almost true. He told them that winter would be easier if everyone worked together and trusted those who knew how to manage things. The men nodded and drank. The baker began to sell loaves that were slightly smaller but priced the same. When questioned, he laughed and said the scales were old and temperamental. The tavern keeper watered his ale a little more each week. The shepherds counted their sheep generously when dues were discussed. No one called these lies. They called them adjustments. The village looked well fed. Smoke rose steadily from chimneys. Children ran with red cheeks. When travelers passed through, they remarked on how well the place seemed to be doing. Edric heard these things and said nothing. One evening, as dusk pulled long shadows across the lane, Bronan called a gathering near the storehouse. He stood with his hands clasped, his voice carrying easily. "This winter," he said, "we must be sensible. The forest has given us much, and we must take what we need without fear. If we hesitate, we will freeze." A murmur of agreement followed. Bronan continued, "Some worry too much about numbers and rules, but rules do not warm a hearth. Wood does." Several heads turned, not quite toward Edric, but close enough. Edric stood at the edge of the crowd, his arms folded, his face unreadable. Bronan smiled. "We will take from the forest what is required. And if the steward asks questions, we will answer him as one." The crowd nodded, relieved. That night, the wind rose. It was not a storm, but it carried a sharpness that made shutters rattle and dogs whine. Edric woke before dawn and went to the forest edge. He knelt where fresh stumps bled sap into the soil. He touched the ground, which felt colder than it should have. When he stood, he noticed that the birds were silent. Days passed. A hunter returned with empty hands and blamed bad luck. Another lost his way in a part of the forest he had walked since boyhood. A cartwheel snapped on a root that had not been there before. Small things, easy to dismiss. Bronan dismissed them readily. "The forest changes," he said. "That is its nature." But Edric saw patterns where others saw chance. One morning, he found a tree he had marked months ago lying split and ruined, its best wood left to rot. He knelt beside it and felt something like grief, sharp and unexpected. "You were not ready," he said, and did not know why he spoke aloud. That night, Edric dreamed of the forest as it had been when he was a boy, tall and open and breathing. In the dream, paths shifted when he tried to walk them, and every step left a deeper mark than the last. He woke with his heart racing. In the village, Bronan slept soundly. He had secured what he wanted. The men who cut wood now owed him favor. The storehouse looked full. The steward had not returned. When whispers reached him about strange sounds in the forest and missing hunters, he waved them away. "Fear grows faster than trees," he said, "and it feeds on idle minds. But fear, like rot, does not need much to begin." One evening, as villagers shared stew and bread, a child cried out near the edge of the fields. People ran and found her standing pale and shaking, pointing toward the trees. "It moved," she said. Something moved. Bronan crouched and smiled. A fox, perhaps, or an owl. But the elders exchanged looks. Edric stood behind them and watched the forest line darken as the sun sank. For the first time, some in the village began to wonder whether the forest was still listening, and whether it liked what it heard. When the forest turns away. Winter did not arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, as it always had, through colder mornings and longer nights, through frost that lingered in the shadows and breath that showed even at noon. At first, the village welcomed it. The storehouse looked full. Bronin made sure everyone saw the stacked logs whenever he passed by, and he spoke often of preparedness. Fires burned early in the evenings, and the tavern stayed loud with voices that insisted everything was well. But the forest did not answer winter as it once had. The first sign was the paths. A shepherd named Aldwin went out before dawn to check his flock and did not return by midday. By sunset, men went looking for him with lanterns and dogs. They found him near the old lime trees, shaking and ashamed. The path moved, he said again and again. I walked the same way I always do. Bronin clapped him on the shoulder. Cold does that, he said. It plays tricks on the mind. Aldwin nodded, grateful for an explanation that required no blame. Then the fires began to fail. Wood that should have burned clean smoked and hissed. Sparks died too quickly. More logs were fed into hearths, but rooms stayed cold. Children coughed longer. Old bones ached deeper. The baker complained that his oven would not hold heat. The tavern keeper swore his chimney drew poorly. Everyone used more wood than planned. Bronin ordered more cutting. Axes rang through the forest from dawn to dusk. Men worked faster, cutting deeper into places that had once been avoided. They brought back wood in heavy carts and praised themselves for their effort. Edric watched from the edge of the trees. He saw how the ground grew bare and slick where roots had been torn free. He saw how young trees were crushed beneath careless falls. He saw how the forest no longer felt like a place that held its breath, but like one that had already exhaled and would not draw air again. One morning, Elspeth found him standing beside a stream that had run clear for as long as anyone remembered. The water was cloudy. It will settle, she said, though her voice lacked certainty. Edric knelt and dipped his hand. The bank has been broken upstream, he said. Too many trees taken too close together. Elspeth wrapped her cloak tighter. You speak as if the forest hears you. I speak as if it remembers, Edric replied. That night, a wind rose that carried no storm but rattled doors and kept people from sleep. Somewhere in the forest, branches cracked in long, hollow sounds that echoed farther than they should have. Children cried out from their beds. Dogs refused to leave doorways. Bronin walked the lanes the next morning, calm and smiling. Cold nights make noise, he said. Fear makes it louder. But fear did not need his permission. A hunter did not return. This time, it was not a man known for wandering or drink. It was Oswin, steady and careful, who knew the forest as well as any living soul. When the search party found his bow broken and his tracks circling the same stand of trees again and again, no one laughed. The elders gathered in whispers. They spoke of old sayings that had not been spoken aloud in years. They spoke of forests that closed their paths and of places where sound carried warnings. Someone mentioned the old boundary stones. Bronin dismissed it. Stones do not guide men, he said. Sense does. But sense had grown thin. Food spoiled faster. Smoke hung low over the village, stinging eyes. The forest no longer gave fallen branches easily. Men had to go deeper for less. Edric went alone one evening, farther than he had gone in months. He followed a narrow trail that twisted as if uncertain of itself. The air felt heavier there, and the light faded too quickly. He stopped when he reached a clearing that should not have been there. The ground was churned and bare. Stumps stood like broken teeth. In the center lay a tree that had been cut and abandoned. Its heartwood split and wasted. Edric knelt and pressed his palm to the earth. It was cold. Not the cold of winter air, but the cold of something withdrawn. "I warned them," he said softly. "I spoke plainly." The forest answered with silence. When Edric returned, Bronin was waiting near the storehouse. "You walked too far," Bronin said. "People notice." Edric met his gaze. "They should." Bronin's smile flickered. "You unsettle them." "They are unsettled because something is wrong," Edric replied. Bronin stepped closer. "What you feel is not proof. We need wood. We need warmth. We need order." Edric shook his head. "You need truth." Bronin's face hardened. "Truth does not keep a child from freezing." "Neither will lies," Edric said. That night, snow fell for the first time. It was light, but it clung to branches and weighed them down. In the forest, a great crack echoed, deeper and louder than any before. In the village, fires burned low. For the first time, no one slept easily. The night the village divided. The storm announced itself long before it arrived. It began as a pressure in the air that made breathing feel heavier than it should have been. Dogs whined and refused food. Smoke from chimneys sank instead of rising, clinging low over the village as if the sky itself had pressed down. People noticed these things and spoke of them in uneasy voices. Someone said the wind smelled wrong. Someone else said the clouds were moving too fast for the season. A woman crossed herself when the church bell gave a short, lonely sound, though no hand had touched the rope. As dusk fell, fear spread faster than darkness. Shutters were pulled tight. Fires were fed early. Families gathered closer than usual, speaking in low voices that stopped whenever the wind moaned through the lanes. When the storm finally broke, it did so with violence. Wind tore across the open fields and struck the village head-on, ripping loose thatch and flinging it through the air. Rain followed in hard sheets that stung skin and turned the lane into running water within minutes. Carts shifted, fences leaned, roofs groaned under sudden strain. People rushed from cottage to cottage, shouting warnings, dragging children inside, trying to secure what should have been secured hours earlier. In the chaos, Bronin moved through the village, his voice loud and practiced. "Stay where you are," he shouted. "Keep inside. This will pass." Some clung to his words because they had always done so. Others clung because they did not know what else to do. At the far edge of the village, where the last fence sagged and the forest began, Edric stood watching the storm's path. He saw what others did not. The wind struck hardest where the land lay open. It gathered speed across the fields and smashed into the village without mercy. Where trees had been cut back too far, the forest edge offered no shelter, only weakened trunks that twisted and groaned. But beyond that damaged edge, deeper inside the forest where older trees stood close and their roots held the earth, the wind changed. It broke apart, scattered by bark and branch, robbed of its full strength. Elspeth reached Edric, soaked and pale. "People are frightened," she said. "Some want to flee." Edric nodded. "They should. Bronin says staying together in the village is safer." Edric shook his head. "Staying is only safer if the place can hold." A crash interrupted them as a shutter tore free and slammed into a wall, splintering. Edric raised his voice enough to be heard above the wind. "The fields are the worst place," he said. "The forest edge is no better. But there is an old stone way deeper in a low hollow where the trees still stand thick. It will not protect houses. It may protect people." Fear answered him first. "The forest is dangerous," someone cried. "Trees are falling," shouted another. Bronin pushed forward, rain running from his beard. "You will lead them to their deaths," he shouted. "This village has endured storms before. We stay. We endure." Edric met his gaze. "Enduring is not standing still," he said. "It is choosing where to stand." The crowd hesitated, torn between a familiar voice and an unfamiliar truth. Then the wind struck again, harder than before. A cart lifted and overturned. A section of fence collapsed. Somewhere, a roof began to tear loose with a sound like ripping cloth. The village broke in two. Some stayed with Bronin, pulling doors shut and pressing themselves against walls, trusting that the storm would pass before anything worse happened. Others followed Edric. They moved quickly, heads down, hands locked onto sleeves and shoulders. Edric went first with a lantern held low, guiding them away from the open ground and past the most damaged edge of the forest. Once beneath the deeper canopy, the sound changed. The wind still roared, but it no longer struck as a single force. Leaves and branches caught it, breaking it into fragments. The air moved unpredictably, but with less violence. Edric found the old stone path as promised, nearly swallowed by mud and roots, but solid underfoot. He placed each step carefully and spoke calmly. "Follow the stones. Do not rush. If someone stumbles, stop together." They moved into the low hollow where the land dipped and the oldest trees grew close. There, the ground held firm, and fallen branches lay mostly beyond them, dragged down by wind that no longer had full strength. They huddled together, cold and soaked, listening to the storm rage above them but not through them. Back in the village, the storm showed no restraint. The storehouse door tore loose, and part of the roof collapsed inward. Heavy beams crashed down, crushing stacked wood and sending splinters flying. A man named Harith was caught beneath one of the falling beams. Those near him tried to pull him free, but the rain made everything slick and the wind pressed down hard. When they finally dragged him out, his body was broken and unmoving. Elsewhere, pain spread. A woman was struck by flying debris and thrown against a wall. Her leg shattered badly, bone tearing through skin. An old man slipped in the rushing water and struck his head on stone. He lived, but his eyes no longer focused, and he could not speak. Another man was pinned by a collapsed fence, his shoulder crushed. Cries filled the village, mixed with the howl of wind and the crack of breaking wood. Bronin shouted orders that no one could follow fast enough. His words were lost in noise, his certainty drowned in rain. By the time the storm weakened, the village was already broken. Near dawn, the wind finally spent itself. Edric led the group back through the forest as gray light spread between the trees. They emerged to a village they barely recognized. Several cottages were destroyed beyond repair. Roofs lay scattered in wet heaps. The storehouse stood half collapsed, its contents ruined. Mud and debris filled the lane. Villagers moved slowly among the wreckage, tending the injured with shaking hands. Harith lay covered with a cloak near the ruined storehouse. No one spoke loudly. When those who had gone into the forest were seen returning together, unharmed, heads turned. No one said their houses had been saved by leaving. They had not. But no one could deny that the worst losses had fallen where people had stayed. In the silence that followed, the village understood something it could not argue with. The storm had not judged them. Their choices had. The weight of what was lost. Morning did not bring relief. It brought clarity. Gray light spread over the village and revealed damage that the night had hidden. Roofs lay torn and soaked. Walls leaned at angles that promised collapse. The lane was choked with mud, broken tools, and splintered wood that no one bothered to move yet because no one knew where to begin. The injured were laid out where there was space. Doors were pulled from hinges and set across barrels. Tables were dragged from cottages and placed in the open air because many rooms were no longer safe to enter. Groans drifted across the village like low fog. Harith's body lay near the storehouse, covered with a cloak that had once been blue. Someone had placed a stone at each corner to keep the cloth from lifting in the wind that still moved restlessly through the wreckage. People avoided looking at him directly. They spoke in murmurs, as if a loud voice might wake him. Elsbeth moved among the injured, her hands steady though her face was pale. She bound wounds, set splints as best she could, and whispered instructions that people obeyed without argument. Edric stood nearby, carrying water, holding lamps, lifting beams when asked. He did not speak unless spoken to. Bronin stood apart. He had washed the mud from his hands, but it clung to his boots and the hem of his cloak. He watched the village with eyes that darted from ruin to ruin, as if searching for a place where his words might still fit. Before midday, he gathered people near the damaged storehouse. "We must be careful," he said, raising his voice. "Panic will only deepen our losses. Storms kill." This was beyond any man's control. A few nodded. It was easier to agree than to think. Bronin continued. "If people had not run into the forest, if we had stayed together, we might have helped one another sooner." The words fell into the space between people and stayed there. Someone finally spoke. "My brother stayed," a man said hoarsely. "He stayed with you. He is the one with his shoulder crushed." Another voice followed. Harith stayed. The name landed heavily. Bronin lifted his hands. "I did what any leader must," he said. "I told people to endure, to trust." "To trust words," an old woman said, her eyes hollow. Instead of looking, murmurs grew. Bronin's gaze flicked toward Edric, who stood among the injured. "He frightened people," Bronin said. "He split the village." Edric looked up. He did not raise his voice. "I told them where the wind was weakest," he said. "I told them where the ground would hold." Bronin's jaw tightened. "And what of Harith?" Edric's eyes moved to the covered body. "I did not tell him to stand beneath a failing roof," Edric said. "I told him the truth. He chose where to stand." Silence followed. thick and uncomfortable. Elspeth straightened from where she knelt. "He did not lie," she said. "Not last night. Not ever." Others began to speak, slowly at first. "He warned about the forest edge weeks ago. He said the paths would change. He said the storehouse was counted wrong." Each sentence was small. Together they were heavy. Bronin stepped back as if the ground itself had shifted. "You would blame me for a storm," he said sharply. "No," a shepherd replied. "We blame you for teaching us to ignore what we saw." The accusation struck deeper than anger. By afternoon, the village council that had not met in years gathered in the open because no roof felt trustworthy. The elders listened. They asked questions. They did not hurry. Bronin spoke at length. He explained, justified, softened, and redirected. His words were smooth, but they slid off the morning like water from stone. When Edric spoke, he spoke briefly. "We took too much," he said. "We listened to comfort instead of the land. The storm did not choose us. We chose how to meet it." No one argued. When the elders finished conferring, their decision was not shouted. It was stated. Bronin would no longer serve as reeve. He protested loudly at first, then desperately, then not at all. The village had heard enough words for one lifetime. As people drifted away, Edric remained by the storehouse. Elspeth joined him. "They will ask more of you now," she said. Edric shook his head. They should ask more of themselves. They stood together, looking at the forest line, which had lost branches but still stood. The village would not be the same, but it was still alive. And for the first time since the storm began to gather, the truth felt heavier than fear and steadier. What remains? The days that followed did not feel like days at all. They felt like work measured by breath and muscle and patience. The village did not rebuild at once. There was no sudden surge of hope, no loud declarations about the future. People rose at first light because there was too much to do and too little strength to waste. The dead were buried properly. Harith was laid to rest on a low rise beyond the fields, where the ground was firm and the water did not gather. No speeches were made. No lessons were spoken aloud. Those who stood there understood without being told that words had already taken enough space. The injured healed slowly, if they healed at all. The woman with the shattered leg would never walk as she once had. The old man who had struck his head remembered faces but not names. Others carried smaller hurts that lingered in cold weather and quiet moments. No one called these things misfortune anymore. They were consequences. The forest was left alone. At first, this was not a decision but a hesitation. Axes were not lifted because arms were tired and hearts were heavy. Then the hesitation became habit. Wood was gathered only from fallen branches. Paths were walked carefully and left as they were found. No one marked new trees. Edric did not tell them to do this. They watched him and followed. He worked as he always had, cutting little, mending much, speaking rarely. When people asked him questions, he answered plainly and without flourish. When they asked what should be done next, he told them what he knew and admitted what he did not. This unsettled some. They were used to certainty, even false certainty. They were not used to a man who refused to sound wiser than he was. Bronin remained in the village. Without his office, he seemed smaller, though his body had not changed. He helped carry beams and clear debris. Sometimes he spoke, then stopped himself. Sometimes he said nothing at all. No one drove him away. Punishment, the village had learned, did not always come as exile. Sometimes it came as staying and seeing clearly. Winter arrived in earnest. It was hard, but not cruel. The repaired roofs held well enough. Fires burned low but steady. Meals were simpler and shared more often. Children learned to fetch water and stack wood carefully. Elders told fewer stories but listened more. When the forest creaked in the wind, people paused and paid attention. They did not bow to it. They did not fear it. They respected it. One evening, as the first real snow settled, Elsbeth came to Edric's cottage with a bundle of dried herbs and bread that was smaller than it once would have been. "This is enough," she said, setting it down. Edric nodded. "It usually is." She smiled faintly. "They speak of you as if you are different now." Edric stirred the fire. "I am not. But the village is," she said. Edric considered that and did not disagree. In the spring, the forest began to change. Not quickly and not with spectacle. Small shoots appeared where the ground had been left alone. Birds returned to places they had abandoned. The stream ran clearer, though it still carried the memory of damage in its bends. The village changed with it. There were fewer arguments about numbers and more discussions about timing. Fewer promises and more checking. When someone spoke too confidently, another would ask quietly, "How do you know?" That question became the village's strongest tool. Edric remained a woodcutter. He did not lead meetings. He did not give judgments. When disputes arose, he listened, spoke once if needed, and went back to work. This disappointed some who wanted a hero. The village did not get one. What it gained was steadier. Years later, travelers would pass through and remark on how careful the place felt. They would say the forest seemed close, but not threatening. They would notice that people spoke plainly and did not hurry their answers. If asked why, the villagers would say little. They might mention a storm. They might mention a man who never lied. They might mention a night when words failed and choices did not. And if pressed further, they would simply say that the forest still listened. So did they.
Thank you for spending your time with this story. If this story stayed with you, please like the video and subscribe for more narrated life stories.